I got interested in ethnomusicology quite a long time ago. I did my PhD with John Blacking, incidentally, in Belfast. So my interest came actually because I studied Western music for my first 2 degrees, general BA in music and then an MA in composition, particularly electronic composition. And from there I went into teaching, as many graduates of music programs do, and I was quite disturbed by the way that I could compose. I could get commissions to write music, but very few people wanted to listen to it. So I could be paid, even if it was a small amount, to write for an audience, maybe 40 people, and then the piece would just die a death, and yet it would take hundreds of hours to write. At the same time in school teaching, and remember I'm coming from Britain rather than America, kids would come into the classroom and they would hate their music lessons. And yet they'd leave the classrooms, and in those days they'd turn on their Walkmans. They wanted music and they wanted to listen to music, but they didn't really want music lessons. Coupled to that, we've seen a rapid decline in people making music as more and more people consume music, if you like. So I was really interested in, what value, what function music has in society at large. And I could have looked at my own culture, but obviously I'm very subjective, so I decided I needed to go somewhere else. And to do that, I needed some anthropology training, which is why I ended up in Queen's University Belfast working under John Blacking, but taking a lot of anthropology classes. And B, I needed to go to a country that was going through rapid change, so that I had a chance of finding people from, let's call it a traditional society, and people who were consuming pop or sort of elitist classical music. I ended up with Korea and went there essentially not knowing whether I'd be able to do the project or not. I didn't know what the project was to start with. I went there and sort of landed on my feet. So Korea became my main focus. It remains a main focus. A book that I edited came out yesterday on fandom in Hallyu, Korean Wave, which is on music, but many other parts of K-culture, Korean culture, as it's being consumed around the world. I have a book coming out in a couple of months' time from Oxford University Press on North Korean music and dance, which has been a challenge. And during my career as an ethnomusicologist, obviously I've taught fairly widely. I've also researched beyond Korea, places like Kyrgyzstan, Zimbabwe, Nepal, Siberia, Thailand, so a variety of places, even though I'm associated with Korean music. Well, I went to graduate school in Queen's University Belfast. Essentially, I already had an MA in composition, and the challenge in those days, as it often is now, with coming to the States, whether US or Canada, was that professors tended to expect me to start my MA again, which wasn't going to work very well, and obviously is quite costly both in terms of time and cost. I was offered a PhD place in Belfast, and Belfast, essentially ethnomusicology under John Blacking, developed in an anthropology department. And what I already knew by that time was that a lot of the East Asian ethnomusicology, or ethnomusicology being applied to East Asian musics, was very musicologically centered. And that was not going to work for me if I wanted to really work on how people were using music, what they felt its value was. I needed the anthropology training. So under the program at Belfast, essentially for the first year, I was able to do a lot of undergraduate anthropology courses to bring my anthropology up and then keep that anthropology going, because there were anthropology faculty all around me. So Queen's was the place. John Blacking, of course, is very well known in ethnomusicology, and remember his PhD was in anthropology essentially. He considered himself an anthropologist as much as an ethnomusicologist. So it turned out to be the right place. Unfortunately, of course, Belfast was not the place for anybody studying Asian music at that time. It was very difficult. It was very difficult to get resources, and so my supervision was not so much about East Asia. It was ethnomusicology and anthropology. Well, I keep coming back to Korea. I think when I started my PhD, I didn't expect to stay with Korea. I was thinking of going in, my PhD would be in Korea, but then I'd apply it back to cultures of which I was more familiar and part of in Western Europe. That really never happened, and one of the reasons was because in 1986, when I graduated, Britain had Margaret Thatcher as Prime Minister, and she was cutting universities and cutting all the interesting things from universities. So getting a job as an ethnomusicologist at that point was very, very difficult. So I was able to get postdocs, but the postdocs were all mixing or balancing between ethnomusicology and East Asia. Because while Thatcher was cutting things like ethnomusicology, the British government was quite keen that minority subjects such as Korean studies, Asian studies, taken at a sort of larger frame, should be, or people should train and should become specialists. So there was a feeling that Asian studies was needed, ethnomusicology was not. So I really used that to have 5 years of postdoctoral fellowships, but at the same time I developed myself. And there's a difference between British and American PhDs, of course, in that in America you do tend to have some sort of studentship which involves teaching, etc. In Britain that's very rare. So our PhDs tend to be shorter, but they're very research driven. So once you graduate from a PhD, there is a problem that you haven't done much teaching. So while I was a postdoc, I developed my CV in terms of teaching so that I could move into a job eventually. But it was sort of, I suppose you could call it niche marketing, but it was also a reaction to what was available at the time. Because I did that, my research on Korean music and Korean anthropology extended and kept me within that field. So some of the projects I've done on Korea include a book on comfort women, Jeongsindae, the women forced into sexual slavery during the Pacific War, a book on shamanism and Korean shamanism, and I have been working on shamanism quite widely since then. A school's guide to Korea, which was initially published in English, but was then translated, at least in part, for Korean, Indonesian, Italian, languages such as that, for the Koreans themselves to use with schools around the world. So not just music. I also wrote the book for the British Queen's state visit to Korea in 1998, I think it was. And because of this sort of niching as a Koreanist, I'm fairly well known for media appearances on BBC and ITV, Channel 4, the standard things. Ethnomusicology has always gone hand in hand with Korean studies, if you like, which has been a particularly useful way for me to develop my career, but it's also allowed me to keep going back to Korea, particularly South Korea, to an extent North Korea. So I'm very keen in telling my students that if they do a PhD on a subject, they have to remain engaged with that place, with the people, but that also means regular visits. It means going and freshening up, refreshing your knowledge, keeping those contacts going. So obviously I've been doing that for quite a few years now. The highlights, well, I've published far too much in terms of written or edited books. I'm on, I think, number 21 at the moment. So, and again, some are ethnomusicology, some are more to do with East Asian studies or books for particular purposes, such as Britain and Korea. so linking the two together for state visits, etc. The book I produced, in fact just edited but added a couple of chapters at the beginning, on the comfort women situation, which came out in 1995, was used at the UN by the special rapporteur, and some of the material in it has been used for several television documentaries and other purposes. So it was widely distributed. Working on shamanism has been fascinating. The two documentaries I produced with Misha Moltsev, a Saka colleague from Yakutia, were very important to me. They haven't been broadly circulated, but they're always somewhere online. And in the 2000s, for 6 years, I ran a research centre for music and dance performance, with funding from the main British funder, the Arts and Humanities Research Council, which over the 6 years involved more than 130 colleagues, split 50-50 between academics and musicians or dancers. So some of the outputs from that were performances, commissioned performances, compositions, such as in Balinese gamelan, or choreographies for dance. Some of the outputs were joint products. So the book I co-edited with Chartwell Dutiro, the Zimbabwean umbira player who's recently sadly died. Chartwell for 8 years was working with Thomas Mafumo, but came to Britain, came to SOAS initially to do a master's. But I was really concerned there of how musicians or dancers can work with academics to create jointly authored products, or how the musicians and dancers can be taken seriously, if you like. Because I think there is an inherent problem in ethnomusicology. If we go for a PhD for 1 or 2 years to a country, we then come back from that country, we write up our ethnography, and we become the expert. Often the people who really are the experts, the musicians or dancers, get left out. But in becoming an expert, we also often think of the country or the culture as a whole, rather than accepting that we've tended to work with a very small group in depth, the people who would talk to us, interview with us, or work with us in performance. So we may not be presenting something that's the total of that country. So putting something out which says, here's Chartwell, he's the expert, he's been playing umbira, he's Shona, he's been playing since he was 2.5, 3 years old. He has particular things to tell us. That's a sort of very honest thing to do, to say he's the key here, and to put the project together, rather than the academics say this is what's got to happen, was a challenge, but one that was very rewarding. I also produced a book on Korean Kayagam Sanjo in exactly the same way, working with a Korean performer, a very well-known performer, Chae-suk Lee, Lee Chae-suk, and we were very keen to try and match up Korean musicology, which is very well developed, with the sort of ethnomusicology approaches from Europe and America on Korean music. Again, it was a challenge, but it was worth doing. I also did a book on the Manas, the Kyrgyz Manas, with the Manasji, Sapabek, Kazmambetov, which was wonderful because here was this wonderful epic storyteller who, if you spoke a Turkic language you could probably understand. The rest of us, when he performed, we didn't really have a clue what was going on, but we could see it was wonderful. So how do you find a format to produce a co-authored book with some recordings which makes sense for both sides? It was interesting. Linked to that, I also set up a CD and DVD label at SOAS, which a number of our colleagues as ethnomusicologists have been involved with, and a number of our musician colleagues have been involved with. I think ethnomusicology has plenty of value. We learn to understand the world outside our backyard, basically, and that has to be valuable. We learn to understand it in ways that we should be able to apply not just to music, but to other aspects of cultural life, social life. In my work on North Korea, for instance, the worst thing that's happened in the last couple of years was that Donald Trump had a meeting with Kim Jong-un, and the announcement afterwards had no real mention of human rights. And the human rights issues in North Korea are legion. They're very serious, and they had been coming to the fore with the UN Commission of Inquiry and with various other things going on, and we've seen that more or less disappear. So we do, through ethnomusicology, try to understand the world around us, and doing that means getting very close to the people we work with, in some ways to understand their perspectives. It may, in the case of human rights, mean that we become activists in a different way. But we have an impact both on the people we work with and on the people we talk to in our own societies, our own life, or we should have. So within that, the applied ethnomusicology has become a very fashionable term. I would like to teach that we all have to be applied ethnomusicologists. There are different degrees, there are different ways of being activist, if you like, but we all have a responsibility. We certainly have a responsibility to the people we work with. How we interpret that responsibility is a very complex issue. But ethnomusicology clearly has a value there. It takes us outside of the comfort zone of the people we grew up with, that we work with on a daily basis. It makes us aware that the world is a big place, but we are part of that world.